But to begin this episode, author Brian Castro, whose novel Shanghai Dancing won both the New South Wales and Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Fiction, his most recent work is The Garden Book.
It all derives out of being orphaned and being abandoned, I guess, in one sense. But it's not trying to discover any factual element. It's actually writing. Well, you know, writing comes out of all kinds of things: revenge, hatred, love. But when I write, I always find that it's best to think in terms of being abandoned, and then you've got a clean slate to work with, and so you invent the things that hurt you, in a sense, as well.
What things are they, say, for you?
I guess not having a secure background with your family, you know. I was sent to Australia at the age of 11 to boarding school. Then my father lost his business, so I wasn't able to go back. There was just no money to go back. So I was really the original convict, if you like. Even if I escaped from boarding school, there was nowhere I could go. So that sense of self-reliance, I think also, if you take the positive out of the negatives, the self-reliance is what got me through being a writer, because it was so hard. I mean, so hard to carve out a career as a writer, even way back in the 1980s when I began. If I hadn't won the Vogel, for instance, I'm not sure whether I'd still be here today. So it's that sort of luck involved too, that you know, you win something and people hear of you and then you keep moving. I think probably Australia needs to grow up, because it has had a tradition of anti-intellectualism. So the word intellectual was a bit of an insult. I mean, you know, we had examples of people like Donald Horne who tried to say, you know, let's, you know, build our elite intellectual culture up and blah, blah, blah. But we have no problem with that in other parts of the world. I mean, if you're intellectual, it simply means you think a lot. I'm interested in looking at the notions of sexuality amongst different people and the crossovers in sexuality. So what I'm working on at the moment, and I won't talk about it because it's like a little secret again, is looking at that notion of transgender. I find that it's very important to be continuously interested in sexuality, so that the writing actually, you know, is enriched, and to look at different ways of enhancing the prose, you know. Not, I don't mean in terms of titillation of the reader, but just to be interested in life, and that's a very vital element. Sex, you know, in I think all my books, sex is a very important ingredient. Sex and time. I think the secret to art is secretiveness. You are concealing much more than you're trying to reveal, and the revelations do come. But I don't like to tell people what I'm trying to do. Let them find out, and that's the way that I've always been brought up in terms of my own reading. The first reading, you don't understand anything. Then you've got to read it again, and things start to appear, actually, which were invisible before. And that concealment, I think, is very much part of this particular book, because nature conceals and art reveals, as it were. You know, the tree roots are under the ground. When you look at the poems that Swan writes throughout the Garden Book, they do go from rather naive ones to better and better, hopefully, so that by the end she is writing some adequate poetry. I've always, again, played with this idea that one shouldn't try to push oneself out there as a novelist, as a poet, as a you know, essayist or whatever, but writing takes care of itself. So these poems are not presented so much as poems, as just someone's diary, and it's a secret that the reader is privileged to look into, as it were. I sometimes think that a writer is really just a cipher. No one personality exists, because there are so many. Not that you're trying to be someone all the time, I mean, but as a writer, you are taking on all these different voices, different characters, you're inhabiting them, and the more successfully you inhabit them, the better your writing becomes when you're dealing with characters. One of the methods of writing that I use is to write in fragments. So I'm always writing little short stories, but they're really micro stories, putting them in a drawer and then pulling them out and saying, look, there's a bit of a theme running through these particular 5 or 6, and then starting from there. So the fragmentation is also mimetic, I think, of memory, where you don't have a narrative memory. I mean, one doesn't sit here and say, oh, you know, in my childhood, and then you form that story. You actually put things together in your memory. And your memory of something today will change when you think about it tomorrow. So these things are constantly changing, and they're being created all the time.